welcome to Modern Chat Network, where we try to break it down so you don't have to. Today, we're diving into Zimbabwe, and honestly, a single day's news from there tells you everything you need to know. It's this story of deep, deep contradictions. On one hand, you've got signs of economic calm, which is unusual, but right underneath that, political tensions are just bubbling away. It's this incredible nation, with so much potential, being pulled in two totally opposite directions at once. Let's get into it.
You know, this quote from an asset management report, it just nails the feeling on the surface. For the first time in a long time, there's this sense of economic quiet in Zimbabwe. Things feel steady. So the advice from the money people is pretty clear. Hey, whatever you're doing, just keep it steady. Don't rock the boat. But the real question, the one we're going to dig into, is just how fragile is that boat?
And this slide right here, it shows you that contradiction perfectly. It's like two different countries. On the one side, you've got these genuinely good signs of calm. The exchange rate is holding steady, they're pulling in record amounts from gold and tobacco, and almost everyone is using the US dollar, which adds stability. But then, you look at the other side. These are the old ghosts, right? Debt that's just not sustainable, $1 billion in unpaid bills at home, and that constant nagging memory of just firing up the printing presses, a move that, as we all know, only ever ends in disaster.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at that unsteady calm in the economy. Then, we'll shift to the power, the politics, and yes, the prisons. After that, we'll compare what's being promised to what's actually happening. Then we'll get into the human stories. And finally, we'll zoom out and see how all this connects to the rest of the world.
All right, Section 1, the unsteady calm. This period of stability is so strange for Zimbabwe, you really have to ask, what is actually holding this whole thing together? Is it for real?
So what's really propping this up? Well, it's not some huge economic boom, that's for sure. The IMF is basically shouting from the rooftops, telling the government to live within its means because its debt, now over $23 billion, is officially unsustainable. The only reason the currency hasn't collapsed is because the Reserve Bank has, for now, put its foot down and refused to print money to pay the government's bills. So the main takeaway here? This calm isn't built on strength, it's built on restraint. It's a house of cards, really.
Okay, Section 2. Power, politics, and prison. Because this fragile economy, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's happening inside a super tense political world where the whole idea of the rule of law feels like it's being tested every single day. And that brings us to the story of Dr. Walter Mzembi. He's a former government minister who came back from exile in June. He'd apparently been told he'd be safe, but he was arrested almost immediately. And as you can see from this timeline, he's just been sitting there for months. No formal charges, no trial date set, just court dates that get postponed again and again. It raises some really serious questions.
And here's the context that really matters. Mzembi isn't just some guy. He's seen as a political rival to the current president. Critics are straight up accusing the Attorney General of using her office to just sideline him. And remember, key officials in the country are already under sanctions from the US and the EU. This whole situation is so charged that when the president of Zambia apparently tried to ask about the case, he was basically told it was a private matter. So, Section 3, Promises versus Reality. This friction between the shaky economy and the political drama, it leads to another huge contradiction. And that's the massive gap between what the government is saying and what people are actually living through. But first, let's look at a big promise that actually looks like a positive step. For years and years, the state-run company ZESA had total control over electricity. Now, the government has finally opened up the market. Private companies can come in, build their own infrastructure, and sell power right to communities. I mean, this could be a total game changer, especially for what they call dark cities. These are entire suburbs, fully built, that have just never been hooked up to the grid.
Okay, now for a different kind of promise. This one is about food. The government predicted this enormous maize harvest, 2.3 million tons. They were so confident they were calling it a bumper harvest, and they even banned maize imports before the crops were even in.
But then reality hit. According to the government's own official report, this was the actual number. 500,000 tons short. Look, it's better than last year's drought, for sure, but it is not the windfall they promised. They had to quietly undo that import ban. And this kind of thing, this gap between the promise and reality, it hits people directly in their wallets with food prices and just whether it's on the shelves.
On to Section 4, the human story. Okay, so we've talked about these high-level numbers and political chess moves, but how does this all actually impact regular people? Let's just look at a few stories from this one news cycle that show you the real world here. This number,
It represents a national tragedy. 29 people gone in a single horrible moment.
These were the bodies of Zimbabweans who died in a bus crash in South Africa, being brought home to be buried. It was just this moment of national grief, and the government did step in to cover the costs, which was a real gesture of support for those families. It's just a tragic reminder of how many Zimbabweans have to constantly travel across that border for work, for family, for life.
At the exact same time, a completely different human story goes viral. Pictures came out of a young British woman who was an inmate in a pretty notorious Zimbabwean prison, and social media just exploded. You saw comments like this one, basically saying her looks were proof she had to be innocent.
But the reality? It was a world away from the viral photo. Taylor Tamara Simone wasn't framed. She was convicted of trying to smuggle 66 kilograms of cannabis, and she got a 9-year sentence. It's such a stark example of how different social media perception can be from the cold, hard facts.
And that same day's news also pointed to the complicated lives of the diaspora around the world. In the UK, you had Zimbabweans convicted in a big fraud case. Over in Australia, a director of a company fled after it collapsed with millions in debt. These things are happening overseas, but they're still pieces of this complex national puzzle. Okay, last section. Zimbabwe and the world. Let's zoom out one last time, because what happens inside Zimbabwe's borders, it doesn't just stay there. It sends ripples out across the globe.
So, remember Walter Mzembi, the minister who's in prison? Well, he used to be a huge player in global tourism. And this is where it gets really murky. The UN's own tourism body is publicly praising the current government's tourism work, but at the same time, sources are alleging that Mzembi being in prison is actually super convenient for the head of that exact same UN body, who just happens to be Mzembi's old rival. It's a really shocking contradiction between what's being said in public and the alleged politics going on behind the scenes.
And check this out, a fascinating echo around the world. At the same time some people in the US are talking about extending presidential terms past the legal limits, a very similar debate is happening inside Zimbabwe's ruling party about keeping President Mnangagwa in power. It's a wild reminder that these conversations about bending democratic rules, they aren't happening in isolation. It's a global thing.
And that brings us right back to where we started. A nation of contradictions, all seen in a single day. So the fundamental question is still sitting there. After decades of chaos, is this a real moment of genuine stability? Or is this just the quiet, the temporary calm before a very familiar storm comes back? The answer to that is going to decide everything for Zimbabwe's future. Hey, if you like what we do, please like, share, and subscribe. I mean, let's be real, it's so we can get monetized and start earning. It is why we do this. Thanks for tuning in.